I've got the transmission back in the Morris Minor, proving that one man with two jacks and a car up on axle stands can get the transmission out and get it back in. And so now I'm kind of back to where I was before I started that whole fiasco. Everything looks fine in there. I ultimately decided that it was crankcase pressure from the new rings and cylinder honing and that sort of thing that's causing my problem. So I developed a crankcase ventilation system that hooks up to the breather tube right there and goes over to the two carburetors. And we'll see if that reduces the pressure in the crankcase, but it also keeps me from dumping engine byproducts out on the street, so it's probably a worthwhile effort. But now I've started the engine up, and what could possibly go wrong? No oil pressure. At least the gauge is not reading any oil pressure. When I started it up, you can see oil go up the oil pressure capillary tube here, but the gauge doesn't read anything. Before I started this transmission project, I had 60 psi. So now the only thing I know to do is hook up another gauge and find out if I actually don't have any oil pressure or if the gauge has gone bad like the engine temperature gauge did. This is my gauge setup, and back when the car was on the road, the water temperature gauge worked fine, as did the other gauges. But when I started it up after the engine rebuild and all that kind of thing, the engine temperature gauge was not working, so the capillary tube to it must have broken somewhere along the line. Scrounged around my shop, and I had another one, identical, that I have installed. But when I tried to start the engine up and get it up to temperature, I realized I wasn't reading any oil pressure. So now I'm in the process of but hooking up a separate oil pressure gauge to see if it says the same thing. So I know if I'm dealing with a bad gauge or actually no oil pressure. Okay, moment of truth. I've got the little test gauge hooked up to the spot on the engine where the oil pressure is measured, and let's see what happens here. Look at that. How in the world can that other gauge, I mean, this is good news. I'm glad to see that I have oil pressure, but how could that other gauge have gone bad while I was working on the transmission? Yeah, whatever.